Hello, friends. Welcome. Welcome to another exciting webinar from the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. And today is one of my favorite webinars, one of my favorite presentations to present on. It's very interesting, and it covers a lot of things that we don't tend to think about throughout our daily lives. And even as we work with folks who have been survivors or victims of domestic and sexual violence. So this one is entitled Beauty and the Beast and Twilight, How We Socially Normalize Domestic Abuse. So I want to go over a couple things really quick. On your right-hand side, you'll notice on your webinar, your GoToWebinar controls, there's a little drop-down menu for questions. You can go ahead and expand that, and if you have a question, absolutely ask that throughout the webinar, and I will stop as I see the questions, and I'll hopefully get those questions answered. All right. Additionally, you can raise your hand. It's also on your little control panel there, and you raise your hand, and then you can also ask a question that way. So, all right, let's get into it. So our objectives for today's webinar are going to be understanding how domestic and sexual violence are normalized in our media through our everyday lives, even through our speech. These little things that we say every day that we may not realize are normalizing the very abuse that we in our everyday lives and our jobs, our professions, aim to stop and to heal the harm that is done by it. We're going to explore romance narratives. Romance narratives, you may not have heard of the term romance narratives, or maybe you have, you just don't understand what it is. And once we go through it, it's going to make a lot of sense why a lot of our movies and whatnot can be problematic. They can, hurt the folks, and even push this normalization of domestic abuse and sexual assault on folks. All right, we're going to delve into how colonization affected gender roles. So colonization has affected and has molded the way that we see gender, the way that we do gender, and the way that we even value relationships within the U.S. We even kind of talk about how that even relates to domestic and sexual violence. So we're going to break down advertisements and how they use domestic and sexual abuse to make money, right? How we use these everyday social. Oh, I apologize. A little bit of noise here. How they use these everyday nuances to make money, to capitalize on that, and how even capitalizing on abuse can be very productive, right? So understand how we normalize the domestic abuse from movies, from companies like Disney to 50 Shades of Grey, which many of us who work within the field would probably understand that 50 Shades of Grey does resemble a lot of abusive things. All right, let's move on. Okay, so first off, who is the the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition? Who and what are we? So we are Utah's official domestic violence coalition. So we're federally recognized. We're not for profit, and it's really important to remember that we work as a team. So not only are we a collection of trainers as advocates in our offices in Salt Lake, but we partner and connect with community members, domestic violence service providers, sexual assault prevention programs to create a state where abuse is intolerable. So remember that we're not the bosses of anybody. We're here to support, okay? So if you need information, if you need support in serving, effectively advocating for survivors, victims of crime, that's what we're here for. And we offer that through technical assistance, through webinars, through face-to-face trainings, and other one-on-one meetings and program overviews. And our contact information will be available at the end, so don't hesitate to write that down. All right, now we're going to talk about me. So my name is Andy Tremonti. Many of you have probably already met me, maybe heard about me, maybe attended a couple other webinars, but I am the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. That is a big role here at the coalition. So I do a lot of things related to education, Domestic Violence 101, webinars, rural trainings, specifically for underserved survivors like LGBTQ folks, male survivors. So I do a lot here at the coalition. My education history is in psychology and women and gender studies. So working with survivors and domestic violence service providers falls very much into my formal education. I do have about 8 years, almost going on 9, working with LGBTQ and underserved survivors. So half of that was with LGBTQ youth, and then the second half was with mostly adult survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So very interesting combined history there. If you notice these two super sweet pictures down here, the one on the left, we have some miniatures that I paint. So self-care, self-care, self-care. Dungeons and Dragons is one of my hobbies, and it is a hobby that is very effective in providing that self-care and providing that that place that I can recoup, after working with survivors and service providers can be pretty challenging, and make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, right? And the picture on the right are my cats, Jorge and Torico. It is true, I took 2 years of Japanese to avoid having to take another English class in undergrad. And that's where Torico gets his name. All right, so now I want to know who you are. So you know who I am, you know who the coalition is, but let's see who you are. So on your screen, a poll should pop up. So go ahead and click which answer best fits you and your role. So who are you? Who am I? Are you a victim advocate from a community or like a nonprofit? So that would be YCC, SBS, stuff like that. Victim advocate from, so a system advocate, so like police, county, system, government organization like DCFS, DHS, we have social service organization, like Road Home, stuff like that. And then we have other, and that's all the other folks that we do want to capture. So we'll give you, we have about 75% of folks have voted. That's a lot, the majority here. We'll give you another couple seconds to get some of those votes in. All right. Okay, so let's share who we have here. So it looks like we have 47% community-based victim advocates. It looks like we have 0% of the system-based. 20% of y'all are government organization staff. We have 7% social service organizations and 27% others. So I'm interested to see who our other folks are. All right, thank you for answering that. And we'll have a couple more polls throughout. So now let's talk about socialization, okay? So are we going to delve into history a little bit? Absolutely, right? So now we're going to start with the development, the kind of the things that happened throughout the years during and after the initial colonization was happening. So first off, the American colonies, inherited this like patriarchal family structure. And what that meant is the husband, the father was the like the leader of the family, of the group, right? And folks were, expected to labor under the direction of that person, right? It's interesting. The Puritans did have a big role even in how marriage changed throughout the years. So marriage kind of started at this like almost like a contract, right? Very much for like property, right? And that could be physical property like land, and it can also be people like wives and children, right? So we have something, called the substance economy, right? And so that meant that the family was a unit of production. So basically, if your family needed it, you grew it, you made it, right? So you were hungry, you had to feed your family, so you grew those crops. You made those the food, and other families, may do the same thing or have, a little bit different things that they were able to grow, maybe to produce, and there would be some trading among that. So it's really interesting to note that because this, was considered a remarkable time for gender equality, right? Because we're seeing, women's work being valued because it was part of that family unit, a part of that production, right? And this is when we saw the first laws of, being against wife beating, adultery, fornication, and stuff like that. And this is really interesting because you'll actually see this pop up a little bit later in the 70s when we start to see the no-fault marriage laws start to pass, and you didn't have to experience beating or adultery or fornication or these other things to be able to get divorces, right? So back to this top on the colonial law. Interesting enough, husbands had to live with their wives, right? They had to support them financially, assume debts that their wives contracted before marriage, pay their fines if their wives had some criminal behavior, right? So he kind of became the be all, the leader, the controller of this entire family unit, right? And anything and everything they did was kind of put onto them, right? Or onto him. So a little bit later, so this around 1820s to 1860s, we saw what's called the cult of domesticity or true womanhood, right? And so this is really interesting because this kind of set like standards for what it was to be women, what it was to be female, right? And this is after that substance economy kind of dwindled away, right? So that family unit wasn't really making the most of its goods, of its food and stuff like that. We kind of it started moving over to like a market economy, right? So market value of goods and services became standard. So a lot of women's work, a lot of work within that home was devalued because we couldn't really put a price. There wasn't really a price on like cleaning dishes and stuff like that, right? So what we saw emerge was the cult of domesticity, right? And so there's four major tenets to this, right? So we have piety or religion, purity, submission, and domesticity. So piety, and this is really interesting. I want you to remember these, right? Because these are definitely going to come up later when we talk about those romance narratives, right? So piety or religion. So this is like the core of a woman's like virtue, like her core strength, right? Religion essentially belonged to women. So young men looked for piety, and if it was there, like all else would follow, right? So if she was connected to that religion, if she was devout, if she followed the tenets of that religion, then other, wonderful things like love, connection, the family structure being beneficial, seeing these great gains, right? And then we have purity. Purity. I'm sure you can already think about how purity relates to today's world, right? So women must preserve her virtue until marriage, and that virginity, and even the way she acted or behaved, even like the view of her within that society or culture, right? This virginity, she would bestow upon her, husband on the wedding night, and be forever dependent upon him. It's kind of, think about this virgin whore dichotomy that women navigate every day, right? And being like the gatekeepers of this virginity, this great gift, right? And then once that gift is given away to someone, that person either holds it, or that woman loses their power because they've given this thing away, right? So it can essentially work for you, and it can work very much against you, right? And then we see submission. So this is the most feminine and expected virtue, right? So very much like being passive, being submissive, being a responder, right? And think back when we were talking about that substance economy, right? Women, their work was in the home, but their labor was very much based on the lead, the role of that husband, of that father, right? And then lastly, we have domesticity. So a woman's job was basically to bring men back to God. So, almost like it was her role, her responsibility to keep men pure, keep men aligned in what they were supposed to do and what they should do, right? So it affords, security not only from the world, but from delusions and errors of every kind. So this was kind of interesting, right? So we had, men kind of leading the family, women kind of supporting that, but also being the lead, and kind of being the person who was in charge or carried the brunt of, the possible social failings or risings of their family. So the Gilded Age, through the Great Depression. So this is really interesting. So the Gilded Age, this was about the 1860s, 1896, right? This is when we saw something called the cult of rationality. So this is where science, rationality, and regulation were very much valued within the American culture and society, right? And we saw, more women kind of stepping out of that private sphere, that home, doing more things within that public sector, that public sphere, maybe, working or, helping out the greater good. But then we also saw, men were feeling that they were losing their manliness. They were losing leadership throughout their homes and throughout society. So that's when we saw a really big rise of sports and American imperialism, right? So it's really interesting for you to kind of think about masculinity, and even how like imperialism and masculinity, how they go oftentimes really hand in hand. Stereotypically speaking, even the standard that we place men into, right? This conquer all, this kind of be all thing. And then we saw the Great Depression. So it's really interesting because the Great Depression, unemployment was very high, right? We saw folks struggling to feed themselves, to take care of their family. So we saw these men in leadership roles struggling because the world around them was not supporting them for them to support their families, right? And so one of the like the fixes, the solutions for this was to fire women from these jobs that they had gotten and that they were able to hold, and to hire men again, because the way that it was tallied, the way that unemployment worked, was that technically there would be no unemployment because all the men were working, because we had fired and gotten rid of all the women. So very, very interesting there, right? And even like the Social Security Act and Fair Labor Standards, they didn't cover women's work initially. Even Social Security was structured around that breadwinner father and dependent mother structure. So women didn't get benefits or receive benefits, unless they were connected or somehow related to men. And that's kind of interesting. We have seen that kind of throughout history. And even the way that we place value upon, being coupled or being married within the culture today, is that women's worth is often defined by her relation or her relationship to men. And think about, the Miss MISS or MRS, how we address women is based on their relationship and their connection to, historically and traditionally, unfortunately, would be, just men. Right? Okay, so now we're going to talk about the 40s and the 70s. Okay, or 40s through 70s, not just the 40s and the 70s. So the 40s and 70s. So this was really interesting. So, Americans look back on the war that they fought. They fought this totalitarian dictatorship for democratic ideals, right? However, those quote unquote democratic ideals only held true to certain groups within the culture. Oftentimes white folks, generally, white males and stuff like that. It was really interesting because we were seeing more women go to college and get college degrees. However, going into the field, like for example, law, women would be like secretaries, even though they had a law degree, right? So we're seeing this really interesting kind of melding of, before and now, kind of this mix, if you will, right? Very much an very much a part of evolution right here. So it's really interesting because we did see divorce laws change. So beginning in 1970, we saw no-fault divorce laws pop up, right? And so that meant that people can get divorced on reasons other than being used or not taken care of, and all these other things that we talked about previous, is that they could get divorced because they wanted to get divorced, right? We did also see, single women who were never married, those numbers went up, right? And so it's really interesting too, because we're seeing these change in divorce laws and marriages and independence in women. However, the laws and things have not really caught up to that. So women had trouble and were not allowed to buy property unless they were connected to a man or married, right? And this idea of not being able to have a credit card without a man's signature, or being married in his name. So that's very, very interesting. And so you kind of look at like today, and we have this really interesting kind of mixture of gender roles within our society today. So we have some, we see, and oftentimes we do see this in times of war or in times of tension, that these quote unquote traditional gender roles, we kind of fall back on them, right? Because they almost seem safe, right? And they almost seem like, okay, now we all know our roles, we get our job done, we do this, right? And so it's really interesting to kind of see this teeter-totter kind of place that we are today, and how that's affecting domestic and sexual abuse survivors, and how we're seeing laws change, and we're seeing even devaluation of the folks who are in and who have survived domestic abuse situations. All right, so there we go. Okay, and this next concept is very, very interesting. So familialism. So this is the tendency, for a culture to value the family above all, the family privacy, to prioritize the family, above that of the individual. So this also has this like feeling of duty to the other members of the family, right? Is that not only are we doing stuff for ourselves, but the things that we do reflect our family, either benefit our family or hurt our family, right? So very much loyalty, trust, and cooperation are valued. It's interesting because we kind of see, you know, society will evolve and change. However, this institution of family doesn't really change, right? It's really interesting because, you know, in America, you know, Americans, and folks, you know, we tend to, you know, tend to romanticize the past and romanticize these quote unquote like bedrock institutions like the family, right? And you'll see that, and these ideas are going to be popping up when we talk about specifically like these romance narratives, right? And how they really affect the way that we view family, the way that we view relationships, and the way that we view our connection to other humans, right? Additionally, familialism and this idea of this like quote unquote traditional family is very heteronormative. So it not only assumes that you know, the family, what makes a family is a mother, a father, you know, 2.5 kids or whatever, right? But it assumes that we also fall within those roles that heteronormativity dictates, right? So heteronormativity is defined as, you know, basically the assumption that everyone is heterosexual and that heterosexuality is superior to bisexuality or homosexuality, right? So we can see this, you know, when we talk about romance narratives. What relationships, what types of romance are valued within our society? Who is being seen? Who is being represented? Who is seen as the standard, right? And so that can be greatly problematic because we leave a large chunk of the population out of that, right? And even folks who don't seemingly, or we perceive as fitting this model of heteronormativity, they can even be affected, right? Even though they are heterosexual, and even though, you know, they may have a different gender partner. However, if they don't even fit that role or are perceived as such, that can be greatly problematic for them as well. As promised, romance narratives. Romance narratives. This is such an interesting topic to talk about. We may, you know, have heard, you know, chick flicks or rom-com, you know, romantic comedies, and we could maybe, you know, kind of point out like what are some of the characteristics of a romantic comedy? What are some of the characteristics of a quote unquote chick flick, right? How we're gonna break down how those characteristics, these narratives that we see within these romance structures, how they actually aid and add to those the ways that folks use and abuse and exert power and control over other folks. Excuse me. So let's break down what is a narrative. What is a narrative? So we may have heard this, you know, going through a training. We may have heard this in an article, maybe talk to someone, you know, been at a conference and they're talking about these narratives, right? But what does that actually mean? Okay. So first of all, humans try and make sense of themselves through their experiences and through stories, right? Or in this case, narratives. So the human experience is complicated, right? And so we try and comprehend our experiences as a series of like ongoing narratives, like ongoing stories, right? So think of it this way. So narratives are like symbolic actions that have sequence and meaning for those who live, create, and interpret them, right? So think about the stories that are present in your families. Think about, you know, these narratives that are present within your family history and stuff like that, right? So next, narratives are social in nature. Believe it or not, humans are social creatures, very much a social being. So this quote up here, you know, the story of my life is always embedded in those stories of those communities from which I derive my identity, right? So think about, you know, even like where we grow up, right? Think about, you know, where our family comes from, their culture, their community, the way that they interact with each other, right? So our narratives, our stories are going to be different from other people's, but because they're social in nature, we're seeing a lot of sharing, right? So we're seeing these narratives, these stories kind of blend together, right? And so thirdly, so narratives are sought out, you know, when we experience, you know, the feeling of being out of control. Maybe we feel like something doesn't make sense, or we're struggling in our life. We want to understand what's happening. We want clarity, or even just the illusion of it, right? So this can be, you know, think about even when we tell stories, right? Or when we reminisce, when we think about things. Think about the parts of the stories or the parts of the experiences that we highlight, the parts of experiences that we kind of omit, or we may not talk about, right? Or we may not delve deeper into. We may just keep it very surface, but oftentimes they kind of fit these narratives, right? There are many types of narratives out there. We have, you know, the good versus bad, you know, the overcoming oppression, like even like pull yourself up by bootstraps is a common narrative, or seemingly common narrative, right? So remember, at the bottom here, the illusion of it, right? So that's really interesting, especially when we kind of pull that into familialism, right? You know, this idea of putting family first, of the family before the individual. And it's very interesting because the US as a whole is an individualistic culture, right? Very much the person, you know, decides, they kind of like push through their life. They are the leaders of their own life, right? It unfortunately, it leaves out a lot of these social experiences, a lot of these narratives, right, if you will, a lot of these nuances of phenomena that happen within our culture and our society, and it puts that brunt, that weight, that responsibility solely on that individual. And it's interesting too in Utah because we have this very collectivist culture, right? So we have a collectivist culture within an individualistic society, right? And seeing kind of how they're interwoven, and even how our narratives may change a little bit, as opposed to, you know, even other places, you know, neighboring states and whatnot. So now, what is a romance narrative? So these are the stories, these are the actions, the symbolic meanings. Remember, a lot of this is going to rely on that symbolism, like the symbolic meaning of things, right? So behind human relationships and love, right? Think about family, the narrative of family, the narrative of relationship, right? You know, is to find someone who compliments you, find someone who, you know, exhibits feelings or whatnot within you. However, that can be different in different places. So before the Puritans very much had the role of changing, you know, marriage from this very much just a contract, this property, you know, agreement, to introducing that love aspect and that connection aspect to it, right? So our narratives can change over time, right? So depending on what's happening within the society, depending on what's available, even information or dating partners can greatly even change romance narratives. We're going to talk about the two major romance narratives, two biggies today. So the first one is the fairy tale romance narrative, right? I promised you we would talk about Beauty and the Beast. Now, when I was a kid, Beauty and the Beast was my favorite movie. I loved Belle. And of course there was, a beast, scary. I loved animals. I was also a little bit into Sasquatch, so that may have had something to do with it. But this idea, this is very whimsical, very magical, right? Experience that we had this very, seemingly, intelligent, this woman who read and, longed for things deeper in life than, just relationships, just Gaston, right? It was very much a draw for me as a youth and for a lot of other folks. We've recently had a remake, a live action remake of Beauty and the Beast. So this is an example of the Prince Charming narrative, right? So the person is great looking, right? And for a second you're like, wait, Beast? How can Beast be great looking? He's big old hairy Beast. Well, what was the Beast before he was the Beast, right? He was a very handsome, very attractive, very rich prince, right? So great looking, extremely intelligent, right? Being courted with gifts and made to feel special. Being the center of their universe. Think about this idea of love can conquer any hardship, right? So think about when we see love can conquer any hardship, and think about maybe when we feel, even in our own relationships, when there are times of struggle or this, that is something that could, hold us on, right? And this narrative together, seems pretty great, pretty magical, right? Like, heck yeah, I want an intelligent, good-looking person who gives me a lot of cool stuff, and I want to feel special. And I want to feel such an intense, feelings of love and connection that I feel like everything else doesn't matter, right? However, that's not necessarily realistic, right? So let's break it down and how it relates to domestic survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. So this idea of it's not as bad as, right? So this is the most prominent belief related to the fairy tale romance narrative. So, think about working with survivors, the idea, well, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. I mean, there's, other people like, my neighbor, their partner, hits them, and, my partner doesn't hit me. They just yell at me or don't let me go to school or work, so it's not as bad as my neighbor has it. Even like considering yourself lucky, right? I'm lucky to have such an attractive partner, like how could a person like me get someone like them, right? It's really interesting, this idea of bad enough, this third dot point down, the idea of bad enough, right? So most survivors do recall having somewhat of an idea of what would be bad enough for them to not want to be in that situation anymore, or when would it be bad enough for me to reach out, right? And it's really interesting because within this romance narrative, oftentimes, folks who are experiencing this domestic and sexual violence is that they, their partner didn't reach that threshold, that level, right? It just wasn't enough to leave, right? Think about being desensitized, right? So we see a lot of grooming in this romance narrative, like a lot of grooming, right? Like the idea of buying gifts, of being their number one, of, putting that survivor, that person on a pedestal, right? You are so smart. You are so pretty. I am the lucky one to have you, right? This quote down here on the bottom, right? It's like getting into a pot and then slowly being warmed up. How do we cook frogs, right? How do you cook a frog? You put them in there in lukewarm cold water and you warm it up slowly. That way, they don't sense, they don't catch on quick enough to understand that they are literally being cooked alive, right? The good outweighs the bad. How many times have we heard this, right? Even in our friends, our family, even in places that, they may not identify as a survivor, or they may not, be reaching out for services, right? This increased intimacy, or the honeymoon period, right? This Prince Charming has returned when we talk about that cycle of violence, right? And remember, that cycle of violence it isn't a model for every single survivor or person. This person came back, okay, like we had a bad time, something bad happened, but now things are better, right? Or this idea that we hold this person to the standard, or this idea of how they were when we first met them, right? They were so nice, they were so loving, they said so many nice things about me, right? But it's hard for us to kind of come to this place where we realize, that people do change, people do evolve, depending on what stimulus is in their life. That can be jobs, that can be friends, that can be support systems, it can be, potential dating partners. All these things, can change how someone, may react or may interact with a situation, right? And it's hard for us to realize that this person essentially is a different person, right? They are different, from the beginning, because of all these things that come into play, and part of oftentimes we see this grooming part of the domestic violence cycle, and that grooming being the initial stages of gaining that power and control. So after that power and control is kind of had, then things could possibly change, right? So this it's really interesting, because this honeymoon idea or period kind of like assumes that, okay, the bad stuff is in the past, we're in a good place now, right? And so then you kind of lift yourself to being, okay, we're good, everything's great, we're happy, we're in love, and then something bad happens again, right? But oftentimes, but we're not like making these connections, right? Because they're separate instances, they're separate scenarios, right? Because we have this period of awesome, of honeymoon, of love, of romance, right? And so they don't seem connected because there's this period that was so different from this abuse, right? The feeling of, I thought it would get better, right? And this third idea is, I can control it, I can stop it. So this is very victim blaming. This is very much, I control, I can change my partner, right? If I just stop talking, if I just stop burning dinner, if I can just, things will be different, right? And we know that in reality, there's probably nothing that survivor can do to change or to stop that person with abusive behavior from abusing, right? We're assuming we're putting the blame on that survivor, that they're provoking it or that they are causing it, right? This idea of avoiding provocation, avoiding that provoking behavior, right? So this is really interesting. So this is, linked to those gender narratives, where women are expected to like please their partner, their men. Think about when we talked about kind of the little bit of the history of how colonization affected these gender roles. How very much, like in the substance economy, husbands and fathers were very much at the leadership or the top of their family structure, right? And part of this creating goods and means and foods and stuff not only was good for the family, but it was also good for the leader, right? So it's really interesting. So remember the last bullet thought point that we talked about. And then look at this fourth thought down here. Abuse often excused as the partner not being themselves, right? So we're disassociating, we're disconnecting these instances of abuse. We're not seeing that they're connected, right? Or we're seeing that, you know what, they have been such a nice person, they're such a sweet person, that they're just not themselves, right? That something must be happening. This can't be them, because I've known them as this, and this for so long, right? Also, this idea of a good person having a bad day, right? Which leads into the good-bad dichotomy. So in our culture, in our communities, we have it's full of dichotomies and false dichotomies, right? This idea that there's one or the other. There's black or there's white. There's gay or there's straight. There's Republican or there's Democrat. You're religious or you're not, right? You're a good person or you're a bad person, right? And so, folks within this culture, they, tend to believe, even like to believe that, majority of, folks start off as good people, but then they do something that makes them a bad person, right? And we know through things, we know through intersectionality and things like racism, classism, sexism, that this is not inherently true. But, for example, good people don't do bad things, right? And if you're a good person and you do something bad, does that make you a bad person? Right? And so we have this definition, this response of, oh, no, it's just a good person having a bad day, right? It's really interesting because it kind of twists this dichotomy that we've grown up learning, that we've grown up understanding, to kind of excuse that behavior of that person, right? Very, very interesting. Okay, so now a poll should show up on your screen. We're gonna break down Beauty and the Beast a little bit here. So I want to know, does Beauty and the Beast depict domestic violence? Does Beauty and the Beast depict domestic violence? So we have yes, no, I'm unsure. I grew up with this movie and I don't want to think about it. It's a children's movie. How can it be abusive? Right? We have about 50% of folks voted. So let's get a couple more folks in there. About 82%. Hopefully we can get just a couple more voted. All right. Well, let me get this. Oh, we almost have 100% voted. We're at 94. I'll wait 4 more seconds. Okay, so let's get this on your screen. There we go. It should pop up on your screen right now. So does Beauty and the Beast depict domestic violence? Right. So 63 of us said yes. 6% said no. Looks like 13% said I'm sure. 19% said I grew up with this movie and I don't want to think about it. And then 0% said it's a children's movie. How can it be abusive? And this is not uncommon, right? This 19%, I grew up with this movie and I don't want to think about it. There's a reason why I included that answer, right? This is a difficult topic, not only because we grew up with it, right? But also because we may have shown this to our kids, and we don't want to be a good person doing a bad thing, right? We don't want to perpetuate these ideas of domestic and sexual violence, right? And this is kind of where it gets difficult, right? Is because how do we bridge that gap between that, right? So let's break this down. So does the Beast look at or act in ways that scare Belle and those around her? He does, right? Notice how he yells. He's very aggressive. He growls. He grabs things. He He pushes things away. He breaks things, right? Does the beast control what Belle does, who she talks to and where she goes, and also who she sees? He does. Belle is locked in his castle, in exchange for her father, right? She's not allowed to contact anyone. She's not allowed to contact her father. She's not allowed to go to certain places within that castle. She's not even allowed to talk to certain people within that castle, that like home. Right? Third, does Beast make all the decisions? He does, right? Does he decide when she eats, what she eats, where she sleeps, what she wears, what she does, where she can go? He does. Does the beast act like the abuse is no big deal, Belle's fault, or deny it? Well, if you would have come down and eat with me, then you wouldn't be hungry right now, would you? Right? Remember when the beast banged on Belle's door and said, open this door, you come out and eat now. If you don't eat with me, then you don't eat at all. Does the beast isolate Belle? Belle is locked in a room in a castle that she's never been to, right? Not only is she physically isolated, but she's socially isolated as well. Does the beast damage property when he's angry? He does. He breaks furniture. He rips things off the wall. He rushes past and pushes aside the folks that he lives with. When he's angry, especially when he's angry at Belle, right? Or when the utensils and whatnot, feed Belle, right? Does the beast leave Belle in unfamiliar places? She's in a castle she's never been to. She's unable to reach out. She's unable to leave. He kind of leaves her in that room, and then he goes off to his, part of the castle. Does the beast prevent Belle from seeking help? So when we break it down like this, whoa, right? This can be difficult to deal with, right? We don't ever want to be confronted, with something that we may be doing that is hurting other people, right? Or we don't want to be confronted. We don't want to. It's hard to think about something that we grew up with, that we may look back upon and see as being great, as being awesome, right? So now let's talk about dark romance narratives, and let's talk about the difference in the way that we view movies like Twilight, right? So this is interesting. The dark romance narrative kind of constructs abuse as typical in romance relationships. So it's normal for men to have bad spells, right? Because that's what it means to be a man, to mean aggressive, to be angry, right? Notice how this even, like talks about how men are kind of siloed into these emotions. And even though, males, masculine folks experience a whole slew of emotions and human emotions, that they're only allowed to experience a couple, right? So it's interesting because this also says that like abuse and unhappiness are not valid reasons to abandon a relationship, right? It puts this focus, this idea that because women are supposed to be forgiving, that they kind of need men to complete, right? So they almost are there to help men, right? Think about in some even like within Utah, kind of like that role of women is to kind of be supportive and to kind of help men through their like transgressions and stuff like that, right? You have to make it work no matter what, right? That if the relationship fails, you fail. It means that you didn't try hard enough, right? And that place, like, think about the victim blaming and that pressure it places on a survivor, right? A person who's experiencing this. That's a lot of pressure. Additionally, back to that good-bad dichotomy, nice people don't date mean people. Good people don't date bad people, right? And that's very interesting. So it's like kind of slurring these ideals and changing these even these definitions that kind of suit and to almost provide reasons or excuses, right? So others are dealing with the abuse, so can I, right? So one of the major ideas, one of the major beliefs is that I deserved it, right? So this is very victim blaming, this internalized victim blaming. You know, the attribute the abuse to themselves, their actions, and like what they did and didn't do, right? Never think to blame or to hold the other person accountable for what they did, right? You know, think about, you know, these. You may have heard this, you know, from a survivor or even someone that you know and love. You know, maybe I just need to be more quiet. Maybe I just need to wait until they speak. Maybe I just need to. And we talked about that before, right? You know, the idea of I need to change or I'm provoking this, right? Being stuck. How many of survivors, how many of folks who have experienced domestic and sexual violence that you have known or worked with have said that they felt stuck? They felt like they can't escape, right? So think about this like idea of codependency and how codependency is very much romanticized, right? We saw this in the Prince Charming romance narrative, right? Where, you know, that, you know, this person is almost like completes them, or that love will conquer all, right? It's very interesting. So we're seeing this similar kind of idea. It just plays out a little bit different, right? Almost also saying like, hey, this person was doing these great things for me, therefore I have to kind of do something for them, right? Let's see. Oh, and then the last dot point, this idea of virginity, right? And a lot of places do see virginity being associated with marriage. So if the survivor lost their virginity to that person with abusive behavior, then they, you know, felt that they had to stay, right? Kind of like, you know, that you know, women, you know, maybe you know, feminine folks, that, you know, folks like feel, you know, like that they have this like thing that they have to hold on to, and if they, when they give it away, that they're kind of like connected or you know, attached to the person that has that gift or who has taken that from them, right? It's very interesting. It's almost like a like an exchange of power, right? That, you know, this woman, you know, I have this power, and then I you know, I lose my virginity, I give my virginity to this person. This person now holds that power, almost like now holds a part of me, right? So there's a lot of symbolism there as well, right? So let's do the third poll. So does Twilight depict domestic abuse? Okay, so our answers on this one are yes, no, unsure, it's entertainment, why does it matter? Or it's a movie for a teenager, it's just dramatic. Got about 41% of folks voted. 41%. Oh, bumped up to 71% pretty quick. Got 76%. Wait for just a couple more folks to vote. And then we'll move on from this. Y'all are doing awesome. Thank you for your input. This is great. Okay, about 3 more seconds. We're at 82%. All right, so let's share this. And hopefully you should be able to see this poll on the screen here. So this one is a little bit different. So we show that 71% said yes. We show that 14% said no. We show that 14% said unsure. Right? And let's hide that. And it's interesting. So now we're going to go back to that Beauty and the Beast one. So we had 63% said yes and 6% said no. Interesting. So kind of similar, a little bit different though. Okay. So let's get into it. Is Twilight, is it abusive? Are there destructive or criticism, verbal abuse? Oh, absolutely, right? So Edward, you know, telling Bella, oh, that, I didn't even realize that until now, that Beauty and the Beast fell and Twilight fell. That's very interesting. Talks down to Bella, like, tell her, like, you can't do this. I have to protect you. You're, essentially saying she's weak, and even sometimes saying, like, you can't do this for yourself. Like, why do you do that? Almost even placing blame on her too. Like, for the way that she smells. Like, you are so enticing to me, right? Why are you enticing me, right? When we say, when that is said, it's literally placing the blame for the abuse or the blame for, issues on that survivor, on that victim, right? It's because it's your behavior that's doing that to me, right? Pressure tactics. Yeah, absolutely, right? So Edward pressures Bella into staying away from certain people, pressures her, for her safety to stay around Bella, or excuse me, Edward and his family, to pressure her to not be a part of certain things. It's really interesting too. Like, we tend to think that if a movie is fiction or fantasy, that it's not real and it's like kind of outer world, right? But in reality, these are things that teenagers and kids are hearing every day, right? And they're being normalized through the media and the things that they hear and they see. Disrespect? Oh, absolutely, right? So Bella is often disrespected. Not only is her opinion, her word, her lived experiences invalidated, oftentimes they're just ignored, right? Even, sometimes even blaming some of her, the ills that fall upon her, that happen to her, on her being so clumsy or so absent-minded or whatever. Breaking trust? Oh, absolutely, right? Not only by talking to other people, pushing other people away, or when, Bella discloses things or situations that she's been in, for Edward to go out and retaliate and lash out against that person. Isolation, absolutely, right? So not only do we see physical isolation, but we kind of see this pushing away of the social group of social friends, right? Even Bella becoming a part of like these higher class people, with Edward and his family, and so other people don't kind of fit the par, and she doesn't really have time, for them because she's so into Edward. Harassment, absolutely. Edward showing up at her house, quote unquote, watching her sleep, right? It's really interesting that we see this as romantic within our culture, and then we kind of look at it like that can definitely be problematic, right? Even harassing people that she knows, her friends, telling them what they can and can't do, lashing out at them, stuff like that. Threats, absolutely, right? There's a lot of threats, not only towards Bella, her friends, but also towards other people that she's acquainted with, right? Sexual violence, absolutely. This idea that I can't control myself, I'm so powerful that if we did engage in a sexual activity, that you would be so hurt, you would be so damaged, right? But I'm so very much attracted to you that I can't control this, right? Physical violence, absolutely. The way, think about the element of consent here and how we define violence. Oftentimes we define violence by punching and hitting. But physical violence can be taking someone from a physical place and moving them to another, right? Especially without consent, right? So, taking her and moving her around, through the trees and taking her to other places, stuff like that. Having this supernatural strength, and kind of using it to, quote unquote, save her from, may it be a van that is coming towards her that Edward pushes out of the way, or, by picking her up and whisking her off, right? Denial. After, like, for example, after Edward, saved Bella from that van, what did he say? Is like, you're delusional, you're making it up. How can I have gone from this place to that place? Like, I was standing right next to you. Like that kind of sounds like gaslighting to me, doesn't it? Does that sound like that to you? So now let's go into advertisements, right? So this is really interesting. A lot of times when I do trainings and we talk about advertisements and we talk about kind of these systems of oppression and how they, affect folks with marginalized or devalued identities within our society, folks, I oftentimes hear, well, advertisers are just there to make money, right? So does making money supersede the rights? Does making money squash individual power and control? So I want you to, we're going to go through a couple of ads here. I want you to, and a lot of them you can tell what era they were from. And I want you to kind of decide, when do ads start promoting domestic and sexual abuse? So when do ads start to promote domestic abuse? Think of her as your mother. She only wants what's best for you. A cool drink, a good dinner, a soft pillow, and a warm blanket. So this is an ad for American Airlines. So this is from a couple of decades ago, right? So notice how, this is, let her, work for you. Let her do the things for you, right? Think of her as your mother, right? Assuming that your mother, the job of your mother is to care for your every need, right? So notice, so this is for a computer. So notice the look on this woman's face, right? And then notice the text, right? So she has a very confused look, right? And then the text said, "This is a computer," right? It's like she's kind of dumbfounded, like, wow, what? This is a computer? Kind of not knowing, like, not even being able to understand like that complexity of computing in a computer, right? So this is for some like skincare products. So Love's Baby Soft, because innocence is sexier than you think. Look at the imagery here. What are we seeing? We are seeing a very young looking person, right? So we're assuming that they're a woman. We're assuming that they're older than 18, but it's difficult to tell the way that their makeup is done and the way that they're holding like a stuffed animal, right? And so this is really interesting, right? Because this sends the message not only like, oh, soft skin is great, right? But the idea of innocence can also be linked to virginity, right? So it also puts that judgment, that value upon folks who have that power, that virginity still intact, that they hold on to that, right? Husband pleasing coffee, right? Because it is the role of a wife, a mother, a housewife to make sure that her husband is constantly pleased and whatnot. Now this is really interesting. Look at the language on this one, right? It's a wife saver. So get arranged by Brown, equipped with a soil-free oven. Every year, the chore of cleaning ovens claims the good humor of countless housemakers, not to mention damage to hands, knees, backs, and busy schedule. Brown protects wives from ... So this is, it's really interesting. So we're introducing like the convenience of modern technology with that role of being a wife. So it's like, oh, this is going to make your life easy, but in reality, now that it's quote unquote easier to make dinner, that just means that this wife, this mother will have additional tasks, additional things to do because she has more time, not necessarily for herself, right? So cigarettes are like women. The best ones are thin and rich. right? So this, there's a lot going on in this advertisement, right? So not only do we have the words, we have the imagery of a woman in the background, right? Like almost like a silhouette, right? And then we have, you know, a man, you know, smoking a cigarette on the right, and even his gaze is towards that woman, right? This idea of thin, this idea of having to fit a certain standard, right? Does your husband yawn at the table? So remember, this is for Heinz. So how many of us, you know, have Heinz ketchup in our fridge right now, right? The things women have to put up with. Most husbands nowadays have stopped beating their wives. But what can be more agonizing to a sensitive soul than a man's boredom at meals? So that's just the first two sentences, right? So it's placing the value upon making sure that he is fed, because if he's not fed, then you risk the chance of being, you know, hit or being abused, right? That you know, we don't beat our wives anymore, but you still have to fit this standard, right? Are you a woman enough to buy a man's mustard? Mr. Mustard. So mustard's having that kind of that gender, that standard. Like, are you strong enough? Are you can you handle it, right? Women of the future will make the moon a cleaner place to live. That's a very nice spacesuit, very nice. So this is assuming that in the future, you know, women's roles will stay the same and that they will continue to just, you know, clean and take care of the home and stuff like that. And that includes when we inhabit the moon, right? So now we're starting to get, you know, late 80s, you know, 90s. The chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for, right? The mini automatic for simple driving. So we see a woman here, you know, and notice how she is very feminine. She has her nails done. She has several, you know, rings, some jewelry. It looks like she's wearing a dress. Her hair is done. She's wearing makeup. And look at the look on her face, right? It's almost as like, oh, driving is more than I can handle. It's too much. I need help. I need something very simplistic, right? The harder a wife works, the cuter she looks, right? Again, we're placing value. And this is for, it looks like, what's that, cereal? So for the bunch of vitamins that you get. Keep up the house while you keep down your weight. So this is for total cereal, right? So not only do we have to make sure the house is clean, you know, keep up with those domestic chores, but also we have to watch our weight, because that's part of, you know, being female, being feminine, is that we have to make sure that we maintain our body, that we look good, and that we're sexually appealing for our spouses and our partners. Sooner or later, your wife will drive home one of the best reasons for owning a Volkswagen. The first sentence: women are soft and gentle, but they hit things. So, you know, we're assuming that women struggle to use everyday, you know, like technological conveniences, right? That a car is so advanced that women they can't grasp, they can't understand how to operate that. So now we're getting into newer and newer ads. American Apparel, right? When's the last time you looked through, you know, a magazine that you know, was high fashion, or any sort of fashion magazine, Vogue, or anything like that, right? So this idea of, oh, if you, you know, get engaged to someone or ask someone to marry you, that you will be able to have sex with them, right? You'll be given that gift. Esso Supply, all of these motoring needs, except one. So you can get everything for your car, but they don't have women available for you to buy, right? And this is kind of like sees, you know, women's bodies and you know, even being like female or feminine as a commodity, as something that you can buy and trade and sell, right? Blow in her face and she'll follow you anywhere, right? Very interesting. with the cigarettes. If you look through like the history of cigarette ads, there's a lot of this like gender norms and stereotypes that are followed. Keep her where she belongs. We show a picture of a shoe, right? So she's cleaning that shoe, right? Duncan Quinn. So when you look at this picture, what are they selling? What's being sold here? It looks like maybe something fashionable, right? So maybe it's his suit, right? Because it looks like he's taken off that tie, to place over this woman's neck to kind of control her, right? And this is really interesting because like fashion photography and this like fashion industry, it's so interesting because there's this normalization of dead female bodies, dead or dying female bodies, right? And there's a lot of roots in 19th century painting and how a woman being well fed was not enough to like show her wealth, right? Because the working class could afford food. So looking sickly kind of showed that you were wealthy enough to be thin or to be almost dead or dying because you get paid for that medical care, which is so interesting. So then we have this physical, right? Actual physical like abuse, hitting, right? If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee, look at her face, right? She's kind of happy. It's like, ooh, right? She's not sad or upset that this is happening, right? Ford. I would be interested to see how many of these models of car that Ford actually sold in this ad. So we have several women tied up in the back and a man in front, right? So it's showing, hey, it has a lot of room in the back, right? However, you probably don't want to kidnap and abuse, torture women. So again, with the fashion, so what we're seeing, so this looks like it's for, is it Vogue? So notice how we have this police. So we're sexualizing police brutality. She looks gorgeous. She's wearing a very beautiful dress. Her makeup is done, right? And so again, we have these depictions of dead or dying women, right? Next, this one a couple years ago, this was the billboard that was placed, across the nation for this movie. It literally depicted a man strangling a woman, which is very interesting, right? And we know that when strangulation is involved in a domestic or sexual violence situation, that lethality increases significantly. So think about that. When did those ads start to promote this domestic and sexual violence, right? One really important thing to remember, especially when we talk about Beauty and the Beast and we talk about these movies, these things that we grew up with, remember that Mickey Mouse does not write Disney movies. It's the people who are socialized in our culture. The people who are socialized in our culture, right? And we see this little mouse, this kind mouse, as being like the spokesperson for Disney, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Disney or that Mickey is the one that's writing those, right? It's the people who we are also being socialized with and who are socialized in the culture. What? Is there a bonus in here? You better believe it. So yes, I did promise 50 Shades of Grey. I did promise. Let's talk about 50 Shades of Grey. So last poll should pop up. I want to know. I want to know what you think. So what romance narrative does 50 Shades of Grey depict? What romance narrative? Yeah, about 6%, 24. Ooh, that shot up to 24. We're at 47%. Nice. %. Get a couple more folks. All right. The last about a couple more seconds. We'll close this poll. All right. Okay. So we have 20% that said fairy tale or Prince Charming. We have 40% that said dark, 27% who said unsure, and 13% said neither, and 0% it's not real, so who cares? So this is really, really interesting, right? So we have the fairy tale romance part of it, you know, the great looking, the extremely intelligent, you know, the Christian Grey, he's very, very rich. He's in the book, you know, Anna says how incredibly attractive and how she just like looks at him and she just can't, like, oh, he's the hottest person she's ever seen. You know, he's extremely intelligent. Yeah, the way he talks, the way, you know, he takes phone calls, it's 5 words and then the problem is solved. You know, being courted with gifts and made to feel special, right? She receives gifts. She receives, you know, $4,000 set of books, right? Because she talked about in some of their first meetings that she liked, you know, a certain author, and so these set of books shows up at her house. And I actually looked online for how much that specific set of books would be worth, and right now you can buy it for around $4,000. You know, being the center of their universe, right? So, and this idea of made to feel special, right? So, like Christian, you know, is constantly talking about how he just can't stay away from her, how he just can't, you know, stop from, you know, being so attracted to her, and you know that he wants her to, you know, be a part. You know, be a part of this contract and this, you know, this stuff. And, you know, it kind of develops to where, you know, she, you know, kind of moves in with him and kind of becomes like very codependent within him, right? And this idea that love can conquer any hardship. So throughout the book, the movie and stuff, the way Christian kind of talks about it says, well, like, oh, I haven't experienced that before with someone, or you know, I don't sleep in the same bed with people, you know, that's only for, you know, sex, or I don't have sex in my bed, I don't, you know, make love, you know, da 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 da. And so very interesting, right? And then we have the dark romance narrative that it's normal for men to have bad spells. Abuse and unhappiness are not valid reasons to abandon the relationship. You have to make it work no matter what. You deserve whatever your partner does to you. You know, nice people don't date mean people. Others are dealing with abuse, so can I. So it's really interesting. So it's this really interesting combination, right? And so that's why, like, think about how people are like, whoa, this is so interesting. I'm so gravitated toward this. It's like, it's not like what I've seen before, but it kind of is. And it's like this interesting combination of it, right? We had someone here on the question say there are many forms of abuse which, of course, are not gender-based, you know, men only. I know many women who experience domestic abuse to their spouse. Yeah, absolutely, right? And I'm kind of glad you said that, right? And you notice that in kind of the middle of the presentation, we talked about the idea of heteronormativity, right? And that these romance narratives are based on that idea of heteronormativity, you know, the idea of men and women being together, the idea of men being aggressive, sexually, you know, aggressive and available, emotionally unavailable, and women being submissive and, you know, sacrificing and stuff like that. So it's very interesting, right? So that question, that comment that just came in, that is awesome, because when we talk about you know, these romance narratives and these things that we kind of, these standards of romance and relationships that we have, they leave many people out. They leave, and if you were here last time, last webinar, we talked about male survivors, and look at all the things that we talked about there, right? And so it's very, very interesting. So, so let's break this down. Does 50 Shades of Grey depict domestic abuse? So let's talk about coercion. So one of the first major instances of coercion that I noticed when I was reading the book is when, you know, he is talking to Anna about, let me actually get rid of this poll. There we go. Sorry, y'all. Okay. I hope all of you can see that now. Thank you. Okay, so coercion. So like when he finds out that Anna is a virgin, she's never been with anyone sexually, that he gets very angry, right? And he yells at her and says, "You should have told me. You should have told me," right? And then after he kind of calms down, you know, a couple minutes later on that, then he begs her to make love, you know, make love to her. You know, like let's fix your problem, right? So after, you know, many conversations of him saying he doesn't make love, that it's about simply sex and rough, you know, sex, that he simply doesn't make love, and then he's kind of mirroring her words and the things that she wants, like, okay, you make love, you want to make love, you want it to be more meaningful. So then he kind of uses this to have sex with her, right? Another instance of coercion is making her or forcing her to eat. And this is actually even seen within this contract that he like provides her, that she has to eat, you know, from a said list of items, right? Even when they're not together. And this idea, or this thing that he continually says is, I've never ... with someone else. I've never slept in a bed with someone else. I've never this. It's kind of like, it's like using that love, that emotional like connection, even that pedestal, like putting her on a pedestal to kind of get some of that power and control. The next one, minimizing, denying, and blaming. So I noticed that the majority of the minimizing came from Kate, her roommate. So Anna would say stuff to her like, "Oh, I'm not sure, like he did this, you know, it's kind of aggressive, I'm not comfortable with it." And then Kate would say, "Oh, but he's so into you," or, you know, warnings or not, he's definitely into you. There are many times when Christian warns her, like, be careful, you don't know what you're getting into, you should just leave now. And like we mentioned before, those warnings, what they're doing is they're placing the blame for any abuse, anything that happens on that survivor, on that victim, because I warned you, right? You should have known. Additionally, like when she bites her lip, it seems like to be a nervous response for her when she bites her lip, and he, you know, says, "Why do you do that? You know what it does to me," and kind of uses that, kind of blames his behavior that happens after that on the lip. Economic abuse, you know, she has to wear the clothes that he, you know, sets and designates from her, from where she has to use his money to buy those things. And the interesting kind of thing of when, you know, quitting job and moving in and like all these things, and kind of like losing some of that economic stability. So isolation, there's so much isolation in here, right? So the idea that what he does is so extreme and that no one will understand, that you can't talk to other people, the fact that she signs a non-disclosure agreement, and you know, it's pretty obvious that she has no idea what she's signing. She doesn't read it. He says, "You really should read what you signed," but then she signs and he's like, "All right." So kind of like using her lack of experience, her inexperience, to kind of gain that power and control over. And then after they have their first, you know, encounter, you know, she asks, I really want to talk to Kate about sex. You know, I have some questions that, you know, I think she would be able to answer. And he, you know, gets upset. He gets mad, saying that, you know, he provides everything for her. He can answer the questions, that she shouldn't need to go to Kate, right? And also, like her friend Jose, you know, tried to kiss her, was aggressive with her, and he, you know, even like blames and isolates her from Jose. Let's see. So emotional abuse. So this random reinforcement pattern. There's multiple times within the novel, within this sorry for that pop up within this, book, the story where she says, I don't know what mood he'll be in. 1 minute he's happy and the next minute he's mad. And this also comes into play with the grooming aspect of it. So the intimate partner sexual violence, the lack of consent, right? So in this story, it's assumed that a contract equals consent, even though it talks about consent, and the word consent and consensual is said multiple times throughout the book and story, but the actual idea of consent is not necessarily there. So this is also, Anna even talks about this within the book after some of their encounters, that says this contract, the idea of obey, like this is like a marriage contract, right? And think about how culturally we've assumed that if you're married that you have the right to sex or to be sexual with your partner, right? Another thing is really interesting. He instead of asking like, would you like to, would you like if I touched you? Do you like if I touch you like that? He says, trust me, or he'll ask, trust me. And so this is like kind of it seems almost like they're trying to ask consent without actually asking consent. It's like, oh, trust me. But what am I consenting to, right? So that's actually not consent. That's definitely not consent. And even one time when she's reading up on, BDSM, and she, emails him on the laptop that he has provided her, and she says, this is too much. It was nice knowing you. And so instead of him being like, okay, like, that's okay, like, I understand, he shows up to her where she is, and then starts to quote unquote seduce her. She verbally says no, and she pushes him away, and he continues. And so they end up, having sex or whatever. But that, in fact, is not consensual. And there's multiple times throughout the series where that happens, and even where she becomes visibly, she's upset, she's crying after that instance. And then the last one is stalking. So stalking is very, very present in this novel, and it's something that has been romanticized throughout the culture. And we're going to be done here in just a minute. So this idea of someone wanting you so bad, that wants to know everything about you and just wants to be with you, right? So he finds her. So when she was at the bar and she was intoxicated, and I think she called him, where the F are you? Using that quote unquote worry to kind of justify some of his behaviors. And pinging her cell phone and finding out where she is. And there's multiple times when he does that. He shows up to her work. He shows up to other places, and with other people that she knows. And it's really interesting because that sends a huge message that I know where you are. I can find out where you are. You can't hide from me, right? And it's really interesting because if like the BDSM community is very much about consent. It's very much about mutual care, mutual pleasure, and mutual respect, and is in a healthy and safe environment and relationship. And so it's really interesting how this is not in any way what the BDSM community represents or is about. So that's really interesting. So resources. In Utah, we have 15 domestic violence shelters throughout the state. You can find them on our website. You can also find them on Facebook. They offer a number of services, and we work really closely with those folks throughout their state to provide services and support for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So here's the national DV hotline, the hotline, so the hotline.org. Very good. They will connect you with us. They can also connect you with local providers based on like the county and stuff that you're at. So here is Utah's Domestic Violence Coalition link line, very similar to the national hotline. And we have, state information, resources for throughout the state. Very, very good resource. Call it if you have a question. Call it if you're unsure. Call it if you need to know if there's a resource in a certain area. Call it. That's what we're here for. We also do safety planning and other things on there, but it's a really great resource. Last and definitely not least, my contact information. So contact me, call me, leave a voicemail, email me, text me, get a hold of me. If you have any questions, comments, anything, let me know. That is my job. I love to do it. I hope that you enjoyed this webinar. I hope you learned some stuff, and you will be getting some information shortly after this. Thank you for attending. I hope you have an excellent day and a wonderful rest of your week.